This is a hearing on missile defense strategy, policies, and programs in review of the Defense Authorization Act request for fiscal year 2022 and the future year's defense program. First, let me thank our witnesses. We have two panels for appearing at today's hearing. Unlike prior missile defense hearings, we've decided to add a non-governmental witness panel to obtain a diversity of viewpoints on the subject matter before us. The second panel will be our government witnesses to help explain the fiscal year 2022 budget request and answer questions that may arise in the first panel. The defense of our homeland and allies from missiles is a technologically complicated and geographically unbounded problem. Today, most missiles follow a predictable ballistic trajectory based on the laws of physics. And those laws haven't changed since the time of Sir Isaac Newton. They can fly tens of kilometers, as the recent conflict with Israel demonstrated, or thousands of kilometers, with an ICBM moving at about Mach 5. We have spent hundreds of billions of dollars fielding systems to intercept them, premised on this predictable trajectory, and with relatively good success. However, a new class of missiles called hypersonic boost glide missiles are now being fielded with speeds in excess of Mach 20 and with an unpredictable, non-ballistic trajectory. We've not fully fielded systems to track, much less intercept them. These missiles bring back issues of technology and strategic stability that were once at the forefront of the debates in ballistic missile defense decades ago. I hope today's hearing can address the policy implications of this new class of missiles, as well as the advances we're making in intercepting ballistic missiles that we have invested so heavily in. Again, let me thank all of you for appearing today. After Senator Fisher's opening statement, each witness will have 5 minutes for their own opening statements, and then we will alternate with members for 5-minute rounds of questions. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. We look forward to hearing your views on the broader missile defense policy, particularly as we hear renewed calls for limitations on U.S. missile defenses to be discussed in negotiations with Russia. General VanHerck and General Karbler, I also want to express my gratitude to the men and women under your commands who have made some extraordinary sacrifices over the past year in order to perform their mission and defend this nation. We are grateful for their service. With respect to the fiscal year 2022 funding request, I'm pleased to see its support for programs like the Next Generation Interceptor, as well as space-based sensors and hypersonic defense. However, I remain concerned about the overall level of funding for missile defense proposed in this year's budget. Despite continued testimony and numerous classified briefings for members where we hear that threats are growing and becoming more complex, particularly as adversaries increase their development of highly capable hypersonic and cruise missile systems, this budget proposes to fund the Missile Defense Agency at what would be the lowest level since 2016. I understand that these are part of the hard choices being made across the entire defense budget, and the result of adopting a top line that ultimately reduces spending on defense. Nevertheless, I am concerned that this level of funding, especially if sustained into the future, will be insufficient to pace the growing threats facing our nation, and we will be left in a precarious situation as a nation. We rely on the candid testimony of our witnesses to help us understand the difference between a lean diet and starvation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Dr. Sofer, would you make your opening statement, please?
Thank you, Chairman King, Ranking Member Fisher. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee. For most of the post-Cold War period, we've enjoyed a relatively stable bipartisan consensus on the role of missile defense in U.S. national security policy. But that wasn't always the case. Few national security issues provoked more debate during the Cold War than missile defense. The argument hinged on how one perceived the relationship between missile defense and strategic stability. One school of thought held that preserving mutual vulnerability by limiting missile defenses was the key to stability during a crisis, and essential for avoiding an action-reaction arms race. The other school of thought, equally strongly held, argued that protection against nuclear missile attack was not only a moral imperative, but that even imperfect defenses could contribute to deterrence of nuclear attack by complicating an adversary's prospect of launching a successful disarming first strike. Well, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, U.S. missile defense policy shifted from building defenses against near-peer powers to addressing the emerging threat to the homeland posed by smaller, more unpredictable regional actors, the so-called rogue states. With a return to great power competition, U.S. missile defense policy must also cope with China and Russia's growing regional missile defense capabilities meant to prevent the United States from reinforcing its allies during the conflict. So by centering on regional missile defense and homeland protection against rogue regimes rather than Russia, policymakers have been able to avoid those bitter Cold War debates about strategic stability. So today, if I may, I'd like to address three issues that seem to be attracting attention in the missile defense policy world. One is continued funding for the Next Generation Interceptor and Homeland Defense more generally. Second is employing the SM-3 missile in support of Homeland Defense. And third, the relationship between arms control and missile defense. So to stay ahead of the North Korean ballistic missile threat to the homeland, the Obama administration added 14 ground-based interceptors to the 30 fielded by the Bush administration. And they sought to enhance the ground-based mid-course defense system through a redesigned kill vehicle, the RKV. The Trump administration altered that acquisition approach to include a fully modernized interceptor, both the rocket and the kill vehicle, and plan to add an additional 20 GBIs to bring the total to 64. It appears the Biden administration has approved the NGI development to proceed. So some national security experts have criticized the cost, the efficacy, and even the necessity for NGI and GMD more broadly. I'd like to offer the following points in response. First of all, while we believe North Korea intends to grow its ICBM force in the coming years, our intelligence agencies cannot know with certainty the pace of that growth. Today, it's reasonable to assume that an additional 20 GBIs, combined with a new kill vehicle and improved reliability of the GMD system, may be sufficient to stay ahead of the threat. We also hope to eliminate a number of North Korean ICBMs on the ground, easing the burden on the GBIs. Second, with respect to costs, we need to understand this in context. Combined NGI and GMD funding will account for about 1/2 of 1% of the DoD budget from FY21 to 26. These are not unreasonable sums to protect a nation against North Korea. Third, proceeding with NGI and Homeland Defense more broadly is important for U.S. grand strategy. Modernizing and expanding our Homeland Defense underpins President Biden's push to revitalize our ties with allies and friends. An important element of renewing alliances is convincing allies that the United States is prepared to run risks on their behalf. Strengthening U.S. Homeland Defenses provides that confidence by reducing our own vulnerability to North Korean reprisals. After all, why would our allies expect us to come to their defense if we are not first willing to provide for our own defense? Finally, Russia and China, they're going to complain about NGI, despite the fact that they are modernizing their own suite of missile defense systems. They deploy more Homeland Defense interceptors than we do, 68 nuclear-tipped missiles, and they are modernizing hundreds of regional air and missile defense systems, a missile defense posture which exceeds the U.S. in some respects. My second issue is the SM-3 missile. As you know, the SM-3 missile is a regional missile based on ships. When we did the the missile defense review in the Trump administration, we asked the question, could we use the SM-3 to provide an additional layer of protection for the homeland in addition to the GBI? In fact, Congress was thinking along the same lines because it directed in the FY18 NDAA that we conduct a test of this SM-3 missile against a simple ICBM target. That test took place last November, resulting in a successful intercept. Now, while the SM-3 2A missile deployed on Aegis ships will continue to play an important regional defense role, the interceptor may provide a modest additional measure of protection for the homeland against North Korean ICBMs in an emergency or during a crisis. The ship would have to be in the right place near our coast at the right time, and given its smaller size compared to the GBI, the interceptor would not provide coverage of the entire United States. Moreover, the SM-3 would not be capable against more complex Russian and Chinese threats, armed with penetration aids and decoys, and nor would it be able to cope with Russia's nuclear air and sea launch cruise missiles that can also range the U.S. homeland. For these reasons, it's unlikely this capability will upset strategic stability for the foreseeable future, if ever. And as President Putin himself has noted, by the end of this year, 90% of Russia's nuclear forces will be modernized and, in his words, quote, capable of confidently overcoming existing and even projected missile defense systems. Now, some have argued that Russia's new novel systems are a response to our missile defense plans. Well, there is an alternative explanation for why Russia is developing these new novel nuclear capabilities. According to Rose Gottmuller, Obama's former New START chief negotiator, she said Putin is after nuclear weapons for another reason, to show that Russia is still a great power to be reckoned with. These exotic systems have more of a political function than a strategic or security one. In my view, it's more likely an improved SM-3 missile, even in limited numbers, will contribute to collective efforts to meet the challenges posed by the North Korean regime, thereby enhancing regional and international strategic stability. In a final analysis, we cannot allow Russia or China to have a veto over the protection of the United States against rogue state threats. Finally, on arms control. There is a suggestion that you cannot have both missile defense and arms control, and I think history suggests the opposite. The United States has been pursuing missile defense seriously since the mid-1980s. This was the Reagan Strategic Defense Initiative, right? And since we withdrew from the ABM Treaty in 2002. So despite the fact that we've been pursuing missile defenses, Russia and the United States have signed 3 arms control treaties that have together drawn down nuclear forces by some 85% compared to Cold War highs. Look, if Russian leaders were seriously alarmed about U.S. missile defenses, they would not have agreed to these reductions, or more recently to extend the New START Treaty for another 5 years. To conclude, I would just add that homeland and regional missile defenses provide protection for the nation, its deployed forces and allies, and are critical enablers of a U.S. grand strategy that relies on alliances to maintain a favorable balance of power and a peaceful world order. For about 2% of annual defense appropriations, missile defense provides the United States the freedom of action to respond to crises, to shore up allies, to deter adversaries, and, if necessary, to defeat them and limit damage should deterrence fail. And finally, deterrence, to be successful, requires the demonstration of resolve. Missile defense is a very tangible measure of U.S. resolve. Failure to do what is necessary to protect this nation against North Korea, a country with one of the lowest ranked economies in this world, could call into question U.S. resolve and commitment in the eyes of ally and adversary alike. This would damage U.S. strategic credibility and have serious implications for America's broader foreign policy objectives. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we're going to submit the backgrounds of Dr. Sofer, Mr. Panda, for the record. Mr. Ankit Panda, please.
Thank you, Chairman King, Ranking Member Fisher, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to be here today before you to offer my views on the missile defense strategy of the United States and its relationship to strategic stability with our nuclear-armed adversaries. My name is Ankit Panda. I'm a Washington, D.C.-based scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where I studied nuclear strategy, missile defense, among other issues. For the last 20 years, we've sought to develop a national missile defense architecture capable of defending the homeland against limited missile threats, namely those from North Korea, which today possesses a minimally capable, rudimentary intercontinental range ballistic missile capability, and Iran, which may one day possess such a capability. Today, our ambitions for national missile defense remain large. Plans to develop a layered homeland missile defense architecture in particular form a major plank of the Missile Defense Agency's near-term efforts. This layered architecture stands to take what was once limited plans for a modest, self-contained homeland missile defense architecture captured entirely in the ground-based midcourse defense system and its 44 deployed ground-based interceptors, soon to be 64, deployed in Alaska and California, and extended to include sea-based Aegis missile defense and eventually even ground-based terminal high-altitude area defense systems. Allow me now to posit that this country's national security could be meaningfully enhanced through the tabling of limitations on strategic or homeland missile defense as part of a reciprocal process involving Russia and possibly China. Doing so would not only reduce fiscal and opportunity costs in ways that would augment both our conventional deterrence capabilities and nuclear modernization plans, but also promote more stable nuclear deterrence with our adversaries. The case for limitations rests fundamentally on a national reckoning with the necessities of nuclear deterrence. As the last administration's 2019 Missile Defense Review notes, we rely on nuclear deterrence to cope with the strategic forces of Russia and China, which are objectively too vast to be fully absorbed by our existing missile defenses. That I do not dispute. But Moscow and Beijing reason about our intentions, as we often do theirs, based on our actions and not our statements. As a result, both fear the ability of our current and future missile defense posture to degrade their strategic nuclear retaliatory capability, if not completely disrupt it. This in turn begets instability. To be clear, I do not posit that our missile defense programs are the sole drivers of Russian and Chinese strategic modernization and force expansion. However, they are salient, and considerable evidence suggests that we are seeing precisely the kind of action-reaction relationship between strategic offense and defense that spurred the first round of US-Soviet arms control during the late 1960s once again today. As was the case back then, limitations should not be unilateral, but should nonetheless be on the table. In particular, as we seek a follow-on agreement with Russia to the 2010 Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the last treaty of its kind to remain in force between our two countries and due to expire in 2026. Congress, in particular, has led on this issue in the past and can do so again. For instance, during the final decade of the Cold War, it was Congress that limited the Reagan administration's desire to reinterpret the ABM treaty in a way that might permit for a capacious expansion of the Strategic Defense Initiative. This facilitated strategic stability, and Congress can once again play this role. So there are numerous ways in which Congress might lead on this issue to forestall what I see as a costly 21st century arms race that's already underway and enhance American national security in the process. First, Congress should ask the Department of Defense to study and assess the extent to which our investments in missile defense are spurring qualitative and quantitative force structure changes by our adversaries. DoD has observed in recent congressionally mandated reports that missile defense is driving certain forms of Chinese and Russian modernization, for instance. A fuller study could inform our national decision-making to ensure a prudent path forward. Beyond this, Congress should adopt a resolution acknowledging the action-reaction relationship between strategic offensive and defensive arms, as the preamble to the New START Treaty in 2010 did. In doing so, this body can render more credible attempts by this administration or a future administration to seek limitations on Russian and Chinese offensive arms of particular concern that would enhance American national security. Finally, Congress should remain actively involved in ensuring the Missile Defense Agency is subjecting the ground-based mid-course defense system to realistic testing and evaluation. This can include mandating testing against ICBM target missiles of longer ranges that would be more representative of, say, a North Korean ICBM. Future testing should also include more realistic environmental and other stressors, including decoys designed to emulate the infrared signature of a target reentry vehicle, something that is eminently within North Korea's reach today. My written testimony for this subcommittee discusses these and other issues germane to today's hearing in greater detail. Thank you for this opportunity today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you both. Mr. Sofer, I'm trying to understand this. Our missile defense system is not designed to intercept missiles from either China or Russia. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And so what is our principal defense against missiles from China and Russia?
The same defense that we had during the Cold War, sir, the nuclear deterrent.
Deterrent. If that is effective against China and Russia, why isn't it effective, or wouldn't it be effective against North Korea and Iran?
Right. Well, North Korea arguably may not have the same rational perspective on these issues as Russia.
But wouldn't the leader of North Korea understand that if he attacks this country, his country would disappear from the map? Wouldn't that, I mean, that would deter even the most unstable leader, it would seem to me.
Well, the question is who's got more at stake at this point. The concern is that he would not believe that we would use nuclear weapons against North Korea for fear of his reprisal against the United States. And by having missile defenses, you take away that consideration.
And let me change the subject slightly to the capability of the missiles. The missile defense system that we're talking about is principally to deal with the threat of ballistic missiles. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And my understanding is that it would not deal with the threat of hypersonic glide vehicles, correct?
Well, currently they do not, but the Missile Defense Agency is working on defense against hypersonics, both against long-range systems and the shorter-range systems our forces would encounter in the regional campaigns.
So we believe that there will be a future capability. Is that going to be a capability of the new missiles that we're talking about authorizing in this process?
I am not completely familiar with the budget request at this point, but I do know that the Missile Defense Agency is working on sensors and an intercept capability against hypersonic threats. But that is not what I was referring to in the SM-3-2A missile. The SM-3-2A is a regional missile, a Navy missile that intercepts ballistic missiles in the mid-course phase. And the hope is that we could give it some capability to also intercept very simple North Korean ICBMs, missiles that are headed from North Korea to, say, Guam or Hawaii or even the continental United States.
Mr. Panda, you talked about the action-reaction. If there's a finite number of interceptors, right now it's 44. We're talking about going to 64. Can't that capability be defeated by North Korea simply by having more incoming missiles?
Excellent question, Senator. So I'll just first note that I'm the author of a recent book on North Korean strategic nuclear forces, and I spend more time than I would like looking at pictures of North Korean missiles. As far as I know, North Korea today has 10 ICBM launchers. As far as I'm also aware, based on open sources, MDA's concept of operations for GMD relies on using 4 interceptors per incoming target reentry vehicle, soon to become 3, but currently 4, I believe. So if we just do the math, North Korea would need to add a single additional ICBM launcher to potentially saturate GMD. And based on GMD's testing record, the single shot probability of kill, which is the probability that a single GMD system shot at an incoming North Korean reentry vehicle would succeed, based on open sources, again, that number appears to be just a little over 50%. So based on that assessment, Senator, I would say that North Korea can probably today bet on delivering a thermonuclear warhead to the continental United States. And I believe that is entirely the reason that Kim Jong-un today feels that he has a nuclear deterrent. He declared in November 2017 that his nuclear deterrent was complete before turning to negotiations with the United States. So I do think that would be a correct assessment of the situation.
But this is exactly what you're talking about, is as you build up your missile defense, then your adversary is incented to build up their side of the offensive capability. Is that your position?
That is correct. North Korea, of course, is quite resource constrained, Senator. So if we were to go to 64 GBIs, I can't predict today whether Kim Jong-un would have the resources or the wherewithal to keep building ICBM launchers and ICBMs to cope with that. I will, however, point out that qualitative modernization is also underway in North Korea. In October 2020, North Korea demonstrated a missile, the largest road mobile missile anywhere in the world today, because most countries don't deploy road mobile liquid propellant missiles like North Korea does. But the missile that they demonstrated appears to be large enough to carry multiple reentry vehicles. North Korea is also working on countermeasures, which will include sophisticated and unsophisticated decoys. And so I completely think that even North Korea can certainly cope with qualitative advancements to our own missile defense.
Mr. Stover, I'm out of time, but I think you wanted to respond.
Right. So, we don't just try to deal with North Korean ICBMs with active missile defense. It's a combination of deterrence, as you suggest, as well as attack operations. We're going to try to find as many of these launchers on the ground as possible and take them out before they launch. And then there's active defense, right? But the bigger point here is if we were not to compete with North Korea, if we were not to build missile defenses against the North Korean threat, what kind of signal is that going to send to our allies? If we're not willing to defend ourselves against North Korea, a country that can barely afford to feed itself, why would their allies think that we are going to risk our own lives to come to their defense?
Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stover, I'm sure you've seen a recent letter by a number of advocates to President Biden encouraging him to discuss limitations on U.S. missile defenses in the upcoming talks with Putin. The letter refers to comments the president made back in 2001 when, as a senator, he opposed the Bush administration's plans to deploy a national missile defense system and predicted it could trigger an arms race with Russia and China. So let me ask you, Did that prediction come true? And what empirical evidence is there linking missile defense to an arms race? And more broadly, is there evidence that missile defense is incompatible with arms control?
Thank you, Senator. I don't think that is what has happened. So exactly what happened. We we withdrew from the ABM Treaty in 2002. Everybody had anticipated at the time that you'd have this huge arms race. Both sides would build more offenses, right, to overcome defenses. And what do we have? We had the Moscow Treaty, which took us from 6,000 under START to 2,200. We went down from 6,000 to 2,200, even though we withdrew from the ABM Treaty, right? And then we had the New START Treaty, which took us down to 1,550. What arms race are they talking about? There has been no arms race. In fact, it's just the opposite. When we signed the ABM Treaty in 1972, the inventory, the Russian inventory, the Soviet inventory went from about 2,500 warheads to over 10,000 nuclear warheads. It was just the opposite. This idea of action-reaction it's too simple. There are many reasons why countries build or choose not to build nuclear weapons. But clearly, our withdrawal from the ABM Treaty, our deployment of 44 ground-based interceptors has not spurred an arms race. The Russians recently agreed to extend the New START Treaty by 5 years. If they were so alarmed by our missile defenses and our plans to add 20 more NGIs, why would they agree to that?
Dr. Sofer, Russia and China have been expanding their nuclear arsenals in recent years, but these actions have come while U.S. missile defense capabilities have remained relatively unchanged. For example, the most significant enhancement of our homeland missile defense system has been the construction of the radar in Alaska. With the failure of the RKV program, our GMD system has not received the upgrades that were planned for that. And then we've seen the expansion, the proposed expansion of the fleet from the 44 interceptors to 64, which was announced in 2017. It hasn't taken place. So I think we have demonstrated also that the SM-32A missile has some capabilities against the ICBMs. But this demonstration was conducted in December 2020, which is long after the Russian and the Chinese have undertaken their nuclear expansions. That's a comment. What is your view of Russia's complaints against U.S. missile defenses and its attempt to portray its actions, such as a deployment of a variety of new nuclear systems that were announced by Putin in 2018 as responses to our nuclear defense programs?
Senator, as the quote I read by Rose Gottmuller suggests, Russia does this for political reasons. They have their own domestic political problems. Putin has to exert his control over the oligarchs, right? He is more concerned about sowing dissension between the U.S. and its allies. Missile defense is a prime vehicle for doing that. And even here in the United States, they interfere with our debates by suggesting that missile defense is something that alarms them. But again, the evidence suggests that despite their talk, they continue to negotiate with us. They continue to reach reductions. I'm not suggesting that we don't talk to Russia about this. Even the Trump administration, in at least 5 occasions, spoke to the Russians about the role of missile defense in strategic stability. And if the Biden administration wants to pursue that, then I think it's totally appropriate.
Does Russia need a nuclear-powered cruise missile to overwhelm our missile defenses?
Clearly not. Clearly not. They have air-launched cruise missiles, sea-launched cruise missiles. So no.
Thank you.
Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Panda, earlier you were talking about the probability of kill of our systems. I think you said a PK of 0.5, roughly. So where does that data come from, if you can say, in an open hearing? And then I wanted to go back to the number of ICBMs that DPRK that you believe they have, and obviously there's 2 approaches to this, right? We can increase the number of GBIs. Currently, I believe we have 44. But the other approach here could be, how do we improve on the PK number? So can you elaborate a little bit about where we are on that?
Absolutely, Senator. So first of all, I've never been in government. I've never held a clearance, so my assessments are entirely based on open sources. The actual PK number is, I believe, classified. The assessment that I'm offering is primarily based on the testing history of the system, which allows us to extrapolate reasonably. Of course, there have been multiple statements made by officials expressing their confidence in the system, which I'll just point out that that's different from the technical parameters of GMD's actual performance. So based on your other observation about the two possible approaches on how we can get our PK up, I will say, Senator, if we are to sustain missile defenses, and when I talk about limitations, I'm not talking about eradicating missile defense by any means. I do believe that the ABM Treaty, for instance, allowed for 100 interceptors at 2 fixed sites per the 1974 protocol to the treaty. What I do want to see is if we do continue to invest in missile defense, that we do it right, that testing and evaluation are realistic. I will point out that GMD has been tested against ICBM-class targets that MDA describes as, quote, threat representative, but to my knowledge, the target missiles used in these tests are far shorter range than an actual ICBM that would have to travel from North Korea's northern provinces, where they base their ICBM forces, to the U.S. homeland. So I will just emphasize that again, Senator. If we are to continue to proceed with maintaining a missile defense, and this is regardless of whether or not we pursue arms control, our missile defenses should be realistically tested and evaluated. If we are going to continue to spend taxpayer money on this enterprise, it needs to be realistic. It needs to demonstrate a capability that is real. Because ultimately, and I believe my co-witness pointed this out, missile defense comes into play when strategic deterrence has failed. And ultimately, no one in this room is in favor of allowing the United States to face a nuclear attack. So if nuclear deterrence is here to stay, my preference, and I'm sure the preference of most Americans, will be that it works as best as it can, and that means that testing and evaluation need to be done properly and done in ways that are realistic. Thank you.
So just to follow up on this, so we're talking with SM-3 GBIs, we're talking mid-course. If we start to look into systems that could intercept in a boost phase, any sense for what kind of probability of kill we would have with those systems at this point?
Sure, Senator. That's an excellent question. Boost phase defense has been a topic of query for over 20 years. There have been multiple studies done. The primary pitfall with boost phase defense is that we physically need to base our interceptors or whatever launch vehicle for the interceptors, be that a drone, a fighter, near the adversary's territory. And really the only country with which this would be viable would be North Korea, which has ocean, international waters on both sides. But again, this would only come into play in a crisis. Effectively, it would be simply infeasible to keep an F-35 or a drone or any other kind of launch vehicle in the air long enough at all times to intercept any North Korean missile launch. Another point that I will point out is that, we've been talking about strategic stability, and you raised this point with boost phase defense. There are, of course, other concepts that we've been looking into, counterforce targeting of North Korean launchers before they can launch, left of launch techniques, including cyber attacks. A subcomponent of strategic stability that hasn't been surfaced in today's discussion is crisis stability. We've talked about arms race stability, and that mostly refers to the peacetime buildups on both sides. Crisis stability refers to our incentives in a crisis. And for Kim Jong-un, knowing that the United States is so fundamentally qualitatively advanced compared to North Korea, the incentives to use nuclear weapons first in a crisis grow the more we indicate that we are willing to destroy his missiles early in a crisis. Kim Jong-un has fundamentally developed these weapons because he thinks that using them first gives him the best rational chance at survival in a conflict. And so I think, if I could counsel one thing, it would be that it's fine to pursue missile defense, it's fine to protect the U.S. homeland from nuclear attack from North Korea, but we need to be careful about the kinds of incentives that we generate for the North Korean leadership in a crisis. Because my assessment is that fundamentally that Kim Jong-un is rational, but that his rationality ultimately has manifested in a way that favors the first use of nuclear weapons in a crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett.
Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I kind of want to follow up a little bit with that. Given that theory, would the same thing apply to, say, to missile tracking satellites and everything else in the value chain? Did those have the same impact on a possible response?
Thank you, Senator. Missile tracking can facilitate counterforce targeting of North Korean assets, and ultimately, because these assets will be used anywhere around the world where our forces need them, they can simply also be used against China and Russia. This has already led to, for instance, Russia's development of a ground-based laser called Peresvet, which is designed to disrupt and dazzle our observation satellites. The Russians don't want us tracking their ICBM transporter Erector launchers. We haven't talked a lot about China today, so let me just offer one observation there. The primary Chinese concern is not solely our missile defense. China is also quite concerned about our conventional precision strike capabilities. Because Chinese nuclear forces are lean, I believe the Defense Intelligence Agency has attested to the fact that Chinese nuclear forces are currently in the low 200s, but expected to double in size by the end of the decade. One of the things that China is particularly concerned about is a conventional campaign waged by the United States against its nuclear forces, which are primarily land-based. The People's Liberation Army Air Force, for the first time since the 1980s, has now readopted a nuclear mission beginning in 2019. But all of this means that missile tracking, while an important component of facilitating missile defense and counterforce, can ultimately be destabilizing.
Dr. Sofer, would you want to respond to that, any of that?
Well, it can be destabilizing, but it can also be very stabilizing if it provides deterrence, right? If China understands that we have these capabilities in place, they won't start a war and you have deterrence at the outset. So in that case, it can be stabilizing. Depends on your perspective.
Yeah, no. Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tuberville.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Souther, you previously stated that a strong missile defense system is exactly how the U.S. prevents escalation and protects our nation. We're falling behind our peers and near peers at an alarming rate. If the U.S. continues down this path, what do you believe the outcome would be, and what changes do you believe what should happen in the next 5 years?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's important perhaps to think of the problem set in two ways. One is the threat to the homeland, right? And that's by Russia and China and by the rogues. For Russia and China, we're going to have to continue to rely on our nuclear deterrent to prevent them from attacking us, right? But for the rogues, we have to stay ahead of them. If we don't stay ahead of them, again, it shows the rest of the world that we lack the will to compete with North Korea and China. And that makes our allies very nervous. So that's the first problem set. The second problem set has to do with regional threats, right? The United States, the strategy of Russia in Europe and China in Asia is to keep us from reinforcing our allies during war. If they can keep us from intervening, they feel that they can win. And so they're building all these missiles, right, in order to attack our bases, our ports, our ships, to keep us from reinforcing. Our policy here is to strengthen our regional missile defenses, help our allies be able to defend themselves with regional defenses, right? And again, all this provides a deterrent at the outset so they don't contemplate even a conventional attack. And I think there's fairly broad bipartisan consensus on that approach to missile defense.
Thank you. Mr. Panda, GMD dates back 15 years. Are you supportive of updating the NGI?
Well, Senator, I think it really depends. If we proceed with NGI, I won't focus on the cost issue, because ultimately, at the end of the day, if we have a missile defense system that can prevent damage to the U.S. homeland from thermonuclear attack and it works, it's very difficult to really put a price tag on that. It's effectively priceless. Of course, if we look at the record, reality is a little bit different there. So once again, I'll just emphasize that if we are to proceed with NGI, and if we are to pony up the big taxpayer bill that comes with that, my preference and my sort of counsel would be that we proceed and demand that testing is done in a way that really does facilitate the development of a missile defense system that can work and can provide that level of defense. Because ultimately, that math I sort of laid out earlier when it comes to North Korean ICBMs, and again, recognizing that is the primary reason we have homeland missile defense, the more we can improve that, the fewer number of interceptors we can assign to incoming reentry vehicles, the harder it becomes for Kim Jong-un to keep up with that pace. Unfortunately, based on our current approach, that just doesn't seem to be viable.
Thank you. Dr. Sofer, you want to add?
I concur, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to thank this panel. You've been very thoughtful and provocative, which is exactly what we needed to discuss the strategic underpinning of this subject. And I want to call our next panel to the table. I hope that both of you, in light of the questions and the discussion today, will file additional testimony if you feel it would be helpful to the committee. Appreciate it. Our government witnesses, Mrs. Lenore Tamaro, who this is your second time in a couple of weeks, so welcome back to the committee. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy. General Glen VanHerck, Commander, U.S. Northern Command, North American Aerospace Defense Command. Lieutenant General Daniel Karbler, Commander, U.S. Army Space and Missile Defense Command and Joint Functional Component Command for Integrated Missile Defense, and Vice Admiral Jon Hill, Director of the Missile Defense Agency. I think we'll start with Ms. Tamaro on the policy question, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for welcoming me back to the subcommittee. Chairman King, Ranking Member Fisher, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on the missile threat and the Department's missile defense policy and priorities. I ask permission to submit my opening remarks for the record.
So ordered.
Thank you. Along with left-of-launch capabilities in our nuclear and conventional forces, missile defense plays a key role in U.S. defense. With regard to the threat environment, as missile technology matures and proliferates, the threat to the U.S. homeland, allies, partners, and our deployed forces is increasing. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, continues development and deployment of more capable intercontinental ballistic missiles that have destabilized and reshaped the security environment in East Asia. Iran's short and medium-range ballistic missiles comprise the largest missile force in the Middle East. Both the DPRK and Iran are extending the range, reliability, and accuracy of their missile forces. Additionally, Russia and China continue to develop and field increasingly advanced and diverse regional offensive missile capabilities. These capabilities form the backbone of their anti-access area denial strategy, intended to deny the United States freedom of action to protect military power and to protect our allies and partners. To address these evolving challenges, the Department will review its missile defense policies, strategies, and capabilities to ensure that we have effective missile defenses. The review will align with the National Defense Strategy and contribute to the Department's approach to integrated deterrence. And we expect to complete this strategy by January of 2022. With regard to Homeland Defense, the Department is committed to defending the United States against rogue state missile threats. DoD recently initiated the development of the Next Generation Interceptor, and NGI will increase the reliability and capability of missile defense of the United States. As this program moves forward, it will align with the administration's defense goals and priorities. With regard to regional defense, missile defenses will also remain central to maintaining the U.S. enduring advantage to flow forces into a militarily contested regional environment and to safeguard those forces should a conflict arise. Additionally, the Department will continue to ensure that we bring a more integrated approach to air and missile defense that not only assists with defense against various types of ballistic missile threats, but also enables defense against cruise missiles and unmanned aerial systems. IAMD will field interoperable and integrated missile defense sensors, interceptors, and command and control to improve capability against a range of threats. With regard to critical enablers, in addition to improving today's operational systems, we're examining new enabling technologies. Secretary Austin has noted the importance of enhancing our global network of integrated sensors. Space-based and land-based sensors enable a variety of capabilities such as detection, tracking, and targeting through all phases of flight for an incoming missile. U.S. commercial innovation is already transforming this field. In FY22, we will continue to develop the prototype hypersonic and ballistic tracking space sensor, the HBTSS, that will allow the tracking of hypersonic threats and add resiliency to our sensor architecture. The Department's approach for regional hypersonic defense will first focus on defense in the terminal phase. Information superiority is critical to the future battlefield and is necessary to enable rapid planning and employment in a joint operating environment. To that end, the department is developing multiple cyber-hardened advanced all-domain awareness for our command and control architectures that will enable timely and accurate decision-making to address emerging threats. And we will continue to develop capabilities for left-of-launch and missile defeat that will play an important role in effectively countering limited missile attacks. With regard to cooperation with our allies and partners, engaging and working with our allies and partners to enhance our collective missile defense efforts is a core focus area for the department. The Indo-Pacific is a model for cooperative missile defense efforts with strong allies including Japan, the Republic of Korea, and Australia. NATO continues to form the backbone of European joint and combined operations. And in the Middle East, U.S.-Israeli missile defense collaboration demonstrates the mutual benefits of technology sharing with our allies and partners, along with our efforts to strengthen missile defense cooperation with key Gulf cooperation countries. Additionally, my office leads a series of dialogues that share information on regional and global missile threats. In conclusion, as the department prepares its strategic review, I can assure members of this committee that we are steadfastly committed to the key missile defense missions and priorities, including working with allies and partners to meet the challenge of growing missile threats in a cost-effective manner that strengthens regional and strategic stability. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Chairman King, Ranking Member Fisher, and distinguished members of the committee, it's a privilege to testify before you again today. I'm honored to serve as the Commander of United States Northern Command and North American Aerospace Defense Command, and I'm grateful to appear beside my colleagues here as they're crucial partners in Homeland Defense. United States Northern Command and NORAD are separate commands, yet work seamlessly to accomplish the critical mission of defending North America against all threats, whether posed by our competitors, natural disasters, or a pandemic. We're in an era of renewed strategic competition, and this time we're facing two nuclear-armed peer competitors, both focusing on circumventing our homeland defenses. Additionally, North Korea's recent unveiling of a new intercontinental ballistic missile capable of threatening North America and Hawaii is meant to constrain options in a crisis. I remain concerned about my ability in the near future to defend the homeland. Potential adversaries continue to develop capabilities to hold our homeland at risk from all vectors, all domains, kinetically and non-kinetically. They seek to exploit a perceived gap between our nuclear deterrent, which I believe is the foundation of homeland defense, and our conventional homeland defense capabilities. To close this perceived gap, we must accelerate efforts to transform our culture to think and operate globally and digitally across all domains and factor homeland defense into every strategy, plan, force management, force design, acquisition, and budgetary decision. United States Northern Command and NORAD are aggressively pursuing a left-of-launch framework that provides the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense less escalatory options that increase decision space and deterrence in strategic competition, vice in-game kinetic defeat in conflict. With the Missile Defense Agency leading the effort, progress on the Next Generation Interceptor is on the right trajectory. But further delays will be detrimental to defense and deterrence by denial capability. We must also capitalize on globally layered multi-threat detection systems such as over-the-horizon radar, hypersonic and ballistic missile tracking space sensors, which can adequately address both my capability and capacity concerns of emerging threats. Progress is also being made on information dominance capabilities within the department. The additional capabilities U.S. NORTHCOM is pioneering, as demonstrated in the latest Global Information Dominance Experiment, are focused on prying data from existing stovepipe networks to enable all-domain awareness. By ingesting data streams into cloud-based architecture, where the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning is unleashed, we can drastically reduce processing times across the globe and rapidly enable information dominance and decision superiority. All 11 combatant commanders endorsing fielding these capabilities as soon as possible. United States NORTHCOM and NORAD will continue to lead and accelerate the department's digital transformation through development of global all-domain awareness sensors and networks, data standards, and infrastructure to share information quickly and efficiently. In doing so, we will improve our ability to defend the homeland against emerging threats, including improved ballistic missiles, low-altitude hypersonics, and long-range, low-radar cross-section cruise missiles. NORTHCOM and NORAD take solemn pride in executing the Secretary of Defense's top priority by standing watch to defend our nation. I'm grateful for the trust and responsibility you place in me as the commander of NORTHCOM and NORAD. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. General Karbler.
Chairman King, Ranking Member Fisher, distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm honored to testify before you today. Thank you, especially during the unprecedented health crisis of this past year, for supporting our service members, civilians, contractors, and their families in your continued support to space and air and missile defense. I'm here today as the commander of the Joint Functional Component Command for Integrated Missile Defense and as the Army's proponent for Air and Missile Defense, or AMD, forces and capabilities. I'm responsible for providing General VanHerck the soldiers who stand ready to defend our nation from an intercontinental ballistic missile attack, as well as the soldiers who provide critical missile warning to Army and joint warfighters. As air missile threats become more diverse and numerous from adversaries worldwide, the Army AMD enterprise continues to work hard to ensure our warfighters and our homeland are protected. I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly thank and highlight the mission accomplishments of our team of nearly 3,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, guardians, and civilians in the challenging COVID environment that we continue to endure. During this past year, in support of SpaceCom, STRATCOM, and NORAD NORTHCOM, these outstanding men and women provided the Army and Joint Force with satellite communications, space situational awareness, and missile warning and defense, and protected our homeland 24/7, 365 from ballistic missile attack. Even in the pandemic environment, they did not miss a beat. To outline one of numerous examples of putting mission first and how Army families have sacrificed during the pandemic, members of our ground-based missile defense crews adhered to 12 consecutive months of stringent measures ensuring the uninterrupted execution of their mission, including sequestering crew members from their homes and families. Essentially, our missile defense crews lived in a bubble throughout their operational rotations on this essential no-fail mission. While they and their families reside in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and Fort Greely, Alaska, the crew members were basically away from their families for extended periods of time. A positive I have drawn from this pandemic is my daily realization that I've never been more proud and thankful for our greatest asset, our people. Every day, I am awed by their dedication and unwavering sacrifices to the nation. I consider it an honor and privilege to lead and serve alongside them. The continued support of Congress is critical to our ability to recruit, develop, retain, and resource such a highly qualified and mission-ready team. I look forward to addressing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Admiral Hill.
Good afternoon, Chairman King, Ranking Member Fisher, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for your time today to discuss the important topic of missile defense. For President Budget 22, MDA is requesting $8.9 billion to develop and deploy homeland defenses against the rogue state threat, improve regional defenses against the existing and the emerging threats. The threat can be summed up as the ballistic, as Senator Fisher mentioned earlier, much less predictable today, but they come with countermeasures and multiple warheads, potentially with nuclear payloads. The hypersonic and cruise missile threats present high speeds and global maneuvering challenges. So despite the pandemic restrictions that General Karbler mentioned now, we have advanced the program on several fronts this past year, and I'd like to walk you through some of those. From command and control and battle management, we call that program C2BMC. We've continued with our spiral upgrades to integrate across the missile defense system, supporting the combatant commands and the services with tracking, queuing, and discrimination data. Discrimination is our fancy word for picking out the lethal object in the complex, and we'll come back to that in just a bit. From a space sensing perspective, improving our detection, our tracking, and discrimination, the hypersonic ballistic tracking space sensor mentioned earlier, that development continues with 2 competitive awards focused on an on-orbit demo in FY23. And we will track dim boosting targets, and we will track hyperglide vehicles. And we need to do that soon so we can leverage that capability in the Indo-PACOM theater, where we will first put out our hypersonic defenses in the hypersonic missile defense kill chain, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. The other space capability I'd like to talk about is a space-based kill assessment, the SCA system. We deployed that a couple years ago. We have a full constellation up, and what we're doing now is taking what we see as the flashes when we get intercept and bringing that to an operational hit assessment for the combatant commander, specifically for General VanHerck, so that he can control the Homeland Defense war. Switching over to land-based sensors was mentioned earlier, the long-range discrimination radar that we have up in Alaska that's being built now. We did have some pandemic delays. The Clear Air Force Base closed. We had radar equipment shipping there. We had to stop it and hold it up. But the team stayed on path building that radar, and we have both panels completed this year. We are now doing radiation, which means the radar is up and running, doing low-power calibration, and we're going to learn a lot. Started off at a very small scale radar out in Moorestown, New Jersey. It's now at its full array size, and we expect to have government acceptance by the end of this year. From a Homeland Defense perspective, we didn't talk much about GBI fleet reliability efforts, the Service Life Extension Program, and I want to thank Congress for their support there. You can't have a weapon system deployed in 2004 and not maintain it, not take those rounds out of the ground and upgrade them. We're doing that now in coordination with NORTHCOM and NORAD. Those missiles come out of the ground, we change out the boosters, we update the software in them, we update the seekers, we update the threat libraries. That builds capacity and capability now so that we can close the gap between now and when we actually deploy the first NGI. What's also important about that is that hardware that's been in the silos for all those years now becomes the basis for the analysis that we do to determine reliability. Last year when we had this conversation, it was purely analytical based because we did not have that hardware available. So the Service Life Extension Program extends the life of the current GMD fleet, increases its capability and capacity, but also gives us the hardware ability to go in and really assess reliability, to build the confidence of the warfighter. We're also expanding a Missile Field 4. Had some fallbacks during COVID, but we leveraged the waterways. We have all 20 silos installed, and now we're doing integration. The next test for GMD, the Boost Vehicle Test 03, BVT 03, we're developing the capability to not just fully burn full kinematics of the GBI system, you can fly it and only burn up to the second stage. And why is that important? It allows you to engage more and more into the battle space. So there's a lot of activity going on with the current GMD fleet that is providing the warfighter higher confidence, higher capability for the future. NGI development, that was mentioned earlier. We are underway today with two competitive contracts, and I think that's really important. The fact that the department has stepped forward to award those contracts and to have two really great teams all the way through critical design review. That is unusual, and I'm telling you, it's going to be hard. But we have the teams that are in place. They're perfectly OCI'd, so no conflicts of interest as we work those that important competition. But why did we do that? So that we can manage the technical risk in the program and so that we can get to emplacement earlier than the government estimate of 2028. And both of our contractors are showing that they're going to come in earlier, and that's a good thing for General VanHerck and the warfighters. Let me switch to the Aegis program. Aegis Integrated Air Missile Defense continues to advance. We are delivering the SM-3 Block 1B missiles on a multi-year procurement. The Block 2A missile, which was a cooperative development with Japan. I'm very proud of what we've done with that missile. We are in production now. The Secretary of Defense just recently gave us permission to take the first 11 rounds that were built out of RDT&E and deploy those today. So that capability is out in the fleet now, and through Global Force Management, it'll go to the right places. We're increasing our ability with sea-based terminal. I'll talk about that in just a second, and continuing improvements within the combat system on the ships and with the missiles and total alignment with the Navy. FTM 44 was mentioned already, executed at the end of last year. Another great COVID story, another great department all-hands-on-deck story. We had it originally planned in May. We executed in November due to the pandemic. We had to do a lot of deconfliction on the range. Dan helped me keep the target in place on Kwajalein. Right, that's a tough area to have a target go into shutdown mode, but we charged the batteries, We made sure that the ship crew stayed safe. We worked very closely with the Navy so the USS John Finn, a new construction integrated air missile defense ship, could go out and execute that mission. That same ship participated in the last GMD test and tracked the ICBM. So we are all about risk reduction, making sure that we do things right. And that was a threat representative target. It was a defense of Hawaii scenario from North Korea to Hawaii. That's what it is. If you look at the geography, that's what we did. So that was a threat representative approved by DOT&E, worked very closely with the intelligence community to ensure that we were threat representative and that we were testing like we fight. Let me shift out to Europe. Aegis Ashore Poland. Right, this has been a tough one. For the last couple of years, we've told you we're at 90% construction completion. Today, I'm going to tell you we're at 90% or more construction completion. But the great news within the last couple months, through the pandemic, you saw that in Europe, we managed to raise the 4 spy radar arrays, put them in place as a forcing function to construction. We also put up the fire control director. That is really great. Now we're ready to do install and checkout for the Aegis combat system. Very important work. We also took the Aegis combat system out of the Connex boxes it's been sitting in for 2 or 3 years, and we ran full digital signal analysis on it to make sure that system works, and we're going to upgrade that system to make sure there are no obsolescence. We are in tight coordination with the Army Corps, and Aegis Ashore Poland is on track to complete its construction. A little bit on Aegis Sea-Based Terminal. That is the first regional hypersonic missile defense capability that is deployed with the aircraft carrier strike groups today. And it's important that we have that capability now because the hypersonic threat is there now. What we want to do is move further back into that trajectory, engage earlier, make the terminal defense even better. And so the glide phase interceptor is under acceleration in the PB22 budget, and that's an important capability for the country. Ties right into HBTSS, ties right into land-based sensors and sea-based sensors that can give us the fuse track that we need to take a hypersonic maneuvering capability out in the glide phase, and then we hit it again in terminal. Let me switch to Guam. PB22 includes funds for the initial development of a survivable and operationally effective IMD for Guam. And those capabilities that I talked about, regional for Aegis, and what I'm going to talk about in just a second in THAAD, are all part of that architecture consideration today. And we're working that hard so that we can come forward and tell you exactly what we're going to do on Guam, staying very close to Indo-PACOM. THAAD, we've continued the interceptor procurement, production, and training support, and we're developing the capabilities to address the evolving threat in very close coordination with the U.S. Army. THAAD and Patriot integration. We have been working that for the last 2-3 years. We completed the first phase where we separate the launchers from the THAAD battery for flexibility for the combatant commander. We have done Patriot launch on remote from THAAD data. Pretty impressive. Also flexibility for the warfighter. And our next test this year is to control the Patriot battery using THAAD. That may not all make sense to you, but what that means is full flexibility where the combatant commands need it, and the Army will be working its urgent material release once we finish that test. So I'll wrap up by saying a little bit about technology, investing in innovative and disruptive technologies to address the emerging threats, including regional, layered hypersonic, and cruise missile defense capabilities. Space sensors, land and sea-based sensors, networked through the command and control battle management system, set the stage for hypersonic and cruise missile defense capabilities. And thank you. I appreciate everything that you do for this committee, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Admiral. This subject gets more and more complicated the more we get into it, because I think when we talk about missile defense, it's important to emphasize we're not only talking about Fort Greely and Vandenberg, we're talking about THAAD, Patriot, and Aegis. You have to understand that from the point of view of this committee, one of the important considerations we have is opportunity cost. This is a tight budget year that we're looking at, and so when you spend money on one thing, that means you don't have money to spend on something else, and that's something that we have to look at. You mentioned something very important, and that is we're developing hypersonic defense. Could you expand upon that, being aware that this is an unclassified setting? Can we defend a carrier against a hypersonic glide missile today?
We have terminal capability today through sea-based.
Terminal means in the last stages before it hits the ship.
And that's typically where you will start on taking on that kind of threat. It happens to be in the hardest environment, though, right? You're in the atmosphere, you're maneuvering, but we do have that capability deployed today, and we're continuing to improve it. Where we need to go is to take it out in that glide phase, and that's the glide phase interceptor that you'll see in the PB22 budget.
We're all talking about hitting bullets with bullets. What's the role of directed energy, and are we putting sufficient resources into directed energy as an alternative, and frankly a cheaper alternative, and perhaps a more effective one to deal with a maneuverable incoming missile?
Yeah. Thanks, Senator. That's a very tough one to discuss in this environment. I'd love to come see you on that one. There are initiatives there. Just can't talk about it here at this session.
Thank you. It is being considered.
Yes, sir.
General VanHerck, I think you used a term that I wrote it down. You talked about prying the out of someplace. Am I correct? Is that what you said?
Senator, Chairman, that's correct. I did say that. There's lots of data from domain awareness sensors around the globe that all too often is not shared to develop a globally integrated picture that would give us the ability to get further left and give decision space to our senior leaders.
I completely agree. And as you know, Goldwater-Nichols was a landmark statute which led us to joint commands, but we don't necessarily have joint data access and capability development. So I hope that's something we might be able to address. But when one of our generals says he has to pry the data out of another agency in order to do his job, I think that tells us we've got a problem we should address.
Well, Chairman, I'm encouraged with the department going down. The Secretary just signed the joint all-domain command and control strategy. We're moving forward, going down that path. I would also say that we're going to have to look at policy and laws as well, especially within the intel community, of sharing data to ensure that we get a full global picture.
Admiral, are you persuaded that the accuracy and the ability of the ground-based interceptors is sufficient to justify the cost? Let me put it in a more difficult question. Which would you rather have, the ground-based interceptors or 5 additional Aegis destroyers?
Well, for the ballistic threat, the GBIs today and the NGIs tomorrow go after that threat. They're spec'd for that. NGI, as you know, it's got a hard requirement on it. It's to cover all 50 states. That's why it's a 50-foot missile and 50 foot in diameter. It's got a hard requirement on it. I would rather have more GBIs and NGIs against that threat. The Aegis ships and what they do for a totally different mission. And they're multi-mission ships. They have a lot of different missions that they're executing.
But THAAD, Aegis, and Patriot have a higher success rate, do they not?
The way the success rate was mentioned earlier is it's always entertaining to me, right? If you have a failure in a program, you're going to learn from that failure, right? We talk about it all the time, right? Hey, learn from your failures, right? So whenever
Yeah,
there
but
is
if there's
a failure,
an incoming missile from North Korea and we miss it,
Right.
learning from the failure isn't going to make people feel better.
Absolutely not. And so that's why over time you want to improve the program. And then your math really needs to take a look at the current configuration that is in the ground and the current configuration that has been tested against realistic targets. If you add up failures from 1998 into the number, of course you're going to have a lower reliability number using that white world information. I will tell you that the reliability is much higher, and I think that the confidence in the warfighter is based on that.
Final question, and my wife says I say finally too much, it gets people's hopes up. But in this case, final question. You heard Mr. Panda talk about more transparency, clarity on testing, clearer reporting on what exactly the targets are. It could be in a classified setting, but would you support that suggestion because it seems to me we have a responsibility as the people who are funding and using the taxpayers' money to ensure that these things are going to work. So would you support additional clarity and transparency with regard to testing?
Absolutely, Senator. If someone's got a security clearance, I will happily talk to them about that. And I'll tell you, we've got a great test record that I'm very proud of. And you can't just look at live fire, right? That's a one shot, right, in a broad battle space. We ought to look at the ground test data, right? That's where your real numbers and your statistics come from. So I'd be happy to show that to anybody that's interested and has the appropriate clearance.
I think that's something we can follow up on. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you all. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Hill, a number of news reports have indicated that the government of Israel plans to submit a request for additional assistance so that they can replenish their Iron Dome system following the recent conflict that we've seen there with Hamas. Has the department received such a request?
I'm going to defer that question over to policy, but before I do that, I will say they're a great partner. We work very closely with Israel on all layers of what they do. And but beyond that, in terms of the emergency acquisition, I'll send that over to policy.
Ms. Tamaro, it's good to see you again. You're going to be a regular here, I think, from now on.
I look forward to it.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being here. Can you answer that question for me, please?
Yes, absolutely. The department is working that request. And as Admiral Hill said, we look forward to working very closely with Israel as one of our closest partners. And so the department is working that request. What I can do is, because it crosses over several departments within DoD, to come back to you and give you more detail.
Okay. I'd like to know if it's going to be a request for supplemental appropriations or if it's going to reprogram resources.
I think if you could allow me to come back and give you a better answer for the record on that. But again, looking for the department is looking at that request for $1 billion.
Okay, great. Thank you. Also, what are the department's plans with respect to conducting a missile defense review? Has that begun? What organizations are involved in it? First of all, are you going to have a missile defense review, and what's the process going to look like on that?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. We are planning to start a missile defense review imminently in the next few weeks, and look forward to working across the department with Admiral Hill's organization, with General VanHerck and Northcom, with the acquisition community within the department. And so it will be done in a coordinated way across the department, and we are planning to start very soon. And we'll look at the threat and the changing security environment. How do we improve and have effective and affordable missile defense for both the homeland and regional defense? And so, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we will do that as part of the National Defense Strategy, and it will also feed into our integrated deterrence review.
Will it be standalone?
That decision has not been made yet.
Okay. Section 1684 of the FY 2017 NDAA requires the department to designate a single entity as the lead acquisition organization for defending the homeland from cruise missiles. To my knowledge, that designation has not been made. Can you update us on what the status of that is?
Yeah, Senator, you're correct. That designation has not been made and is still being worked within the department.
Okay, thank you. Do you think we need it? Do we need that designation?
This is something that the department is still looking at, and I'd ask for your indulgence in allowing me to look across and work with my colleagues on what the best way forward on this is. And I know the previous administration also did a lot of work on this too.
Okay. I'm going to put General VanHerck on the spot and Admiral Hill. What do you think? Do we need a designation like that?
Senator Fisher, I do believe it would be best to have a single entity designated within the department for cruise missile defense of the homeland.
Thank you. Admiral?
Fisher, yeah, great question. I also agree we need a single agency involved.
Good, thank you. I'll try and get another one in. Admiral Hill, does the budget support delivery of the next generation interceptor in 2028? And can you describe the life extension program MDA has developed to ensure the current interceptor fleet remains viable until NGI is deployed?
Thank you, Senator. When I mentioned the Service Life Extension Program earlier, based on congressional support there, we kickstarted that program working very closely with General VanHerck and his team. And that is going really well, and it will increase capacity capability. I mentioned that we will have the old hardware that we can assess, and our assessments of reliability are going to bump up, and we're going to have a lot more confidence in that. So what we're doing is, I don't like to live off of plus-ups. I always appreciate when Congress does that, but then now we're committed to include that in the budget. So you'll see us including that in PB 22 as we move forward. And that PB 22 look into NGI, absolutely, we're in a good place with both contractors moving out to beat the government estimate of first emplacement in 28. That's going to come to the left. I'm going to stay very close to General VanHerck. I'm going to stay very close with all the stakeholders in the building, because what that means is flight testing will happen earlier, which means we're going to prepare those threat representative targets, and we'll be ready to go.
Good to hear. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Senator Rosen via WebEx.
Thank you, Chair King and Ranking Member Fisher, for holding these hearings today. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their service, for testifying, and General VanHerck, always great to see you, spend some time with you like we did yesterday. That was wonderful. I'd like to go right into some missile defense cybersecurity issues. And as MDA works to rapidly deploy missile defense systems to, of course, stay ahead of threats, I'm concerned that we may not be taking potential cyber vulnerabilities seriously enough before we field new systems. In the 2019 Missile Defense Review, software is mentioned only once, and even more alarming, GAO's May 2021 report highlights that none of MDA's 17 operational cybersecurity tests planned for fiscal year 2020 were conducted, and that cybersecurity testing since 2017 has revealed several vulnerabilities. So Admiral Hill, in light of recent significant cyber attacks, of course, I don't have to tell you what they are out in the public space, what steps is MDA taking to address cybersecurity vulnerabilities? And are you conducting cybersecurity testing on all deployed and planned capabilities?
Yes, thanks, Senator Rosen. Part of the difficulty of cyber testing with missile defense systems is often you have to creep into the networks that are operational. So it does require a lot of coordination with the combatant commands. And when you look at what it takes to execute a cyber test in a pandemic, no surprise that there were delays in executing those tests in 2020. But I will tell you, we've conducted a number of adversarial assessments. Those are called the AAs. We've also moved out and done the PCO, which is the persistent cyber operations. We have an agreement with DOT&E to start executing that this next year. So we have the team in place and ready to roll. I absolutely agree with you that is something we should worry about when you look at a system as networked as missile defense is, 18 time zones, tying all the sensors together, fusing data. Absolutely. I want to know where those vulnerabilities are. So when we execute those tests, we take action on them. You can see it in our budget exhibits. You will see cybersecurity across every single element of the missile defense system, and you will see that we are marshaling the best people on the planet to execute those adversarial assessments and the persistent cyber operations.
Well, I appreciate that, and it is a large operation. It is difficult to test. I would argue that a lot of those tests are also done remotely in the privacy of offices. As we do some of those threat assessments, it's important that we get back on a regular schedule because the complexity also means it is more easily, it's more vulnerable because there's many points of entry. But I'd like to move on now and build on Senator Fisher's question about the Iron Dome. So Ms. Tamaro, given the U.S. Army's acquisition, of course, of the Iron Dome technology, what lessons do you think that you've learned or we've learned from the recent Israel-Hamas conflict? And more specifically, are you concerned about the ability of hostile actors to launch a massive barrage of rockets designed to overwhelm these short-range missile systems? And Ms. Tamaro and General Karbler, you can both respond. Ms. Tamaro, you could go first, please.
Thank you. Again, there's been a lot of continuity and support for cooperative missile defense with Israel and supporting Israel's ability and capacity to defend itself, and we will continue to do so. And my understanding is, according to Israel, their success rate is very high.
Well, and maybe, General, you could talk about the lessons learned, because we know maybe we're still analyzing what's just recently happened, but there are lessons to be taken from the most recent conflict. So can you speak to that?
Ma'am, I had the opportunity to go visit the Army soldiers who are out at White Sands Missile Range as we field the new Iron Dome batteries. They're training on the systems. I don't know specifically if the lessons learned have been shared, but I know that the instructors out there, as they go through their certification and training, are providing threat representative scenarios to those soldiers as they go through their training. And we expect that first battery will be ready for deployment at the end of September of this year.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I've toured those batteries myself, and they're quite impressive, and I think there will be a lot of things that we can learn going forward. I believe my time is up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of our witnesses. I think all but one of my questions have been already thoroughly discussed, although I will just add that I look forward to an update on Israel's request for emergency military aid as well, and more details regarding that. But I do have a question for you, General VanHerck, and I've really appreciated our time together, our discussions about over-the-horizon radar, the importance of all-domain awareness, and of course the hugely successful test of the over-the-horizon radar at Camp Grafton a few years ago. And would just ask if you could sort of further explain the importance of over-the-horizon radar and how it increases the capability to defend the homeland, and why you need resources, frankly, to fast-track some procurement.
Senator, thank you. As we look at our competitors or potential adversaries, they've developed capabilities to hold the homeland at risk below the nuclear threshold. Those capabilities that they've developed now are extremely long range. So for example, Russian capabilities to launch cruise missiles now extend to over Russia that can threaten North America. They can also do that from very far ranges from our 2 o'clock towards Europe, and the same thing in the Northwest as well. Today's legacy North Warning System has served its purpose and done well, and we're using a system called Pathfinder to give us some additional capability, but physically the system can't see over the horizon or long distances. So over the horizon radar gives us the capability to have domain awareness much further than we do today, which increases decision space for our senior leaders, and that's a top priority for me. It's also my number one unfunded priority list, is to fast track the site survey, the additional development, so that we can get this domain awareness capability of over-the-horizon radar sooner.
I noticed it on the unfunded priority list, which is why I asked the question, and given my, of course, personal interest. What would be the next steps then for testing and production?
I would have to defer to the service on that one. I'm not sure what those next steps. For us, it would be to get the additional funding here, which is $25 million, to move forward to fast track site development and those kinds of things. As far as testing of the actual system, I'd defer to the acquisition authority on that one.
All right, thank you. That's everything, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Hill, earlier we were talking about terminal phase protecting the aircraft carriers from an Aegis with the Aegis system. My understanding is you talked about a terminal phase intercept. Does that change? I mean, this is a relatively new capability. I assume SM2, SM6, SM6 based. So to get this capability with the Aegis system and an SM6, does that change the ability for the battle group, how it's going to operate? The range of the Aegis destroyer cruiser has to be from the carrier. Does this have other operational considerations? And how long have we been in this mode? Because the hypersonic threat is, as we understand, is real.
Yes, sir. And it's probably a difficult answer. I will say that all carrier strike groups are very dynamic, right? So you're not going to tether a destroyer to an aircraft carrier, right? The destroyer is going to go do its business, and it'll stay in contact with the destroyer, and the strike group commander will determine the positioning of those ships. There's nothing, and remember, I'm the technical developer. There's nothing that I see that causes a constraint on where the destroyer or the cruiser might operate in order to protect the carrier. It's just part of the other many missions that strike group is going to carry out.
And currently, the fire control solution comes from the Aegis system. We're talking a little bit about HBTTS and the test in 2023. Once that system is fully developed, with regards to our carrier battle groups, does this change the way the fire control solution is? Does it then come from the HBTTS system down to the cruiser to launch the SM2?
So the way Aegis works, and you sound very familiar with this, is that the ship is going to control the missile. And so typically for an organic engagement where it's using its own sensor, it's going to drive the missile, because you want to give updates to the missile, right? When you've got a maneuvering target, there's a lot of uncertainty in that flight path. And so the help from the larger, smarter ship to the smaller, less capable sensor on the front end, you want to drive that missile to get to the collision or get it within its what we call region R, right, within its lethal radius. When you bring in off-board sensors, which is a proven fact with Aegis, we have done launch on remote, which means we're launching on that remote sensor, and we've done engage on remote, where the ship never sees it with its own organic sensors. It's just controlling the missile and giving it maneuver commands as it's taking data from another radar. HBTSS will follow a very similar pathway. So being able to see down from space, warm tracks going over a warm Earth, That is really tough science, but we've got that licked. We've shown that we can do that on the ground. That sort of capability gives us that global coverage, but it's going to work the same way. That data will come down and come through C2BMC to the ship, and then the ship is driving the missile based on what it's seeing from HBTSS. So it does give you more dynamic maneuver within that larger picture, but no big major change. Now in the future, it would be great to launch the missile from the ship and have a space asset take it over. We're not there yet, so we're going to crawl, walk, run on that.
All right, well, I'm interested to see how the test goes in 2023.
Yes, sir.
General VanHerck, yesterday we were talking a little bit about cruise missile defense of the homeland, and in the $247.9 million budget to support development of hypersonic defense capabilities, I believe there's about $14 million in there, or there's a requested $14 million for cruise missile defense of the homeland. So, General, what progress can we expect to see if that money's approved by Congress in the coming fiscal year?
So I believe that's money that he's taken internally in the Missile Defense Agency that wasn't actually dedicated towards cruise missile defense, but he's taken that. Is that correct, Admiral Hill?
That is correct. So I am not the designated agent for cruise missile defense of the homeland, but I recognize the need. That threat is real. Stay very close with NORAD and NORTHCOM, and so we have leaned forward to put funding into the budget so that we can help with that architecture work, do the spectrum analysis, get the radars in place. So it's our way to put the foot forward, even though I'm not the designated agent.
I would point out on my unfunded priority list, I do have a request for elevated radar here in the National Capital Region, which would give domain awareness for potential cruise missile threats much beyond what we have today. It also gives a warning awareness for movement of senior officials and those kinds of things. That funding is $27 million.
And you will see that same issue in the unfunded priority list from the Missile Defense Agency.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Sullivan, we're delighted you're here, and we reached a consensus to close Fort Greely.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to be here, and I was actually watching the first panel. So I'm sorry I didn't get down here in time, but I actually do have a comment or two. I agree with Senator Fisher on that. The one witness who was making the argument that somehow the China-Russia nuclear modernization program was driven in part by the GBIs at Fort Greely, I think, no offense to our esteemed witnesses, was one of the more ridiculous arguments I've heard in quite a while. But in Admiral Hill, can you just mention, it's not just North Korea that we're looking at with regard to our missile defense, it's other rogue nations. We have the capability, given our location, with regard to rogue nations like Iran, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I say rogue nations, I mean North Korea, I mean Iran.
Right.
And so NGI and the GBI fleet today was geared to protect us against North Korean and Iranian ICBMs.
Correct. And I also watched the chairman's discussion of deterrence. And I think it's questionable whether Kim Jong-un is a rational actor. I definitely think it's questionable whether the Ayatollahs are rational actors. And I think it's the responsibility of this Congress to make sure we don't place that bet on deterrence. The whole idea is if either of them want to go out in a blaze of glory, we shoot down all their missiles and then we destroy their countries. But we don't get destroyed first. Isn't that the whole point of our missile defense?
Yeah, and I'll defer to policy.
We don't take the punch. We deliver the punch, we parry the punch, and then we deliver the punch.
Right. There's been long consistency that we have missile defense against a limited attack.
Correct.
Against the homeland, but you know, as
we shouldn't take the risk, though, that Kim Jong-un and the Ayatollahs are rational actors and would be deterred by deterrence.
We do, again, correct. If they were to launch a limited attack against the United States, that is the mission of missile defense, and we strongly support continuing.
Let me ask another question, and this is, so the history, unfortunately, of missile defense, and I don't want to be too partisan here, but typically Republican administrations have supported it, Democratic administrations haven't. We've made a good breakthrough in this committee. 2017, my bill, the Advancing America's Missile Defense Act, had 20 Republican co-sponsors, 10 Democrat co-sponsors. So missile defense has become bipartisan, which is really, really important to make it sustainable. But I will tell you, I'm a little bit worried. And Admiral Hill, here's why I'm worried. A, there's some senators who are now starting to ask the question, hey, do we need it at all? That's their prerogative, but I think that's indicative of kind of trying to go back, hey, now that the other party's in charge, we're going to get rid of it. I'm also very concerned about the president's budget, which reflects a 15% cut in the MDA's budget, notably 50-plus programs that the MDA administers. Over 70% are expected to realize a cut, including the ground-based mid-course defense program. So, Admiral Hill, do you have concerns that the requested level of funding will result in reduced readiness and reliability to defend our nation?
Senator, thanks. Great question. First, I will agree with you that missile defense should always be a bipartisan issue.
Yeah, and we've made good strides in that
Yes,
regard.
sir. You know, for me and my team, I always call them the stellar team, and we have a noble mission. Our mission is plain and simple: protect the American people, protect our forward deployed forces and our allies and friends. So straight on that.
To the budget.
Yes, sir. So over to the budget. You know, like all, and we talked about this before you arrived, sir, is, you know, there's a top line reduction. And so we had to prioritize. And I think we did it right. So when you see our unfunded priority list, where we had to take our risk was in production. So you'll see at the top of that list the need to procure more interceptors, because that's where I had to take risk in order to not see the fall off of availability, reliability of the current GBI fleet. In fact, we make sure that program is rock solid and moving forward with the service life extension.
But you'd prefer not to have a 15% cut?
I always prefer to be able to have a full balance of science and technology, development, testing, and sustainment support to the services. Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, can I ask one final question? I know I'm running out of time, and it's one that I'm going to depart a little bit from the primary purpose of today's engagement. It won't surprise you. General VanHerck, as the advocate for the Arctic in terms of the military's capability, you may have seen the Secretary of Defense and the DepSec in their confirmation hearings said that they were going to fully resource the different service strategies, Arctic strategies. I remain concerned that those strategies are not being effectively implemented by the Army, Navy, and Air Force. How do you see the services implementing their respective Arctic strategies as part of this budget submission, given your overall role as the Arctic military advocate as a NORTHCOM commander?
Senator, I think when I look at the FY22 budget, I see a inching along in all of the service. I'm encouraged they all have strategies now, and the department has a strategy, and my strategy heavily relies on the Arctic. But we didn't move the ball very far down the field this year in the budget with regards to resourcing the Arctic.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Tuberville.
Oh, thank you. Senator VanHerck, if the NGI development is delayed, do we have a good backup plan, or are we going to fall so far behind we can't catch up?
Senator, there's not a backup to NGI. As I said in my statement, I remain concerned about my capability and capacity to defend against a ballistic missile threat from DPRK, or even if Iran developed one, and slipping longer than 2028 would increase my concern and risk to be able to meet the mission I've been given.
Thank you. General, you got any follow-up on, Carpenter, you got anything to follow up on that?
So just with respect to, I provide the soldiers that do the missile defense mission. We train to the threat scenarios. We work very closely with MDA through software development, the testing, et cetera, of that. So as the threat evolves, as the software evolves, our soldiers stay trained and ready for it.
Thank you. Admiral Hill, for the second or third year in a row, our number one unfunded priority is a defensive system for Guam. If our number one commander and our number one command is saying that's his number one priority, I believe the best offense is a good defense, and you need both. In your opinion, would a defense system for Guam save the American people money and free up ships for the Navy?
Senator, thank you. You sound like a coach. Absolutely, right? So when I look at defense of Guam, and anybody looks at it, you have to have a sensor architecture, you have to have a fire control network, and you have to have weapons to protect it, right? If you're going to base there, if you're going to leverage offensive power and do power projection from Guam, you have to protect it. So yes, I believe that we do save money. If there was a way for us to free up the ship station so we can give those ships back to the maneuver force of the Navy, that's what we want to go do. So we are looking at regional systems. We're in the middle of that study now, and as soon as we have that architecture laid down, we'll come and see you.
How many ships does it take moving in and out to protect?
So generally, if you're going to have one station, you're going to need 4 ships, right? You got one coming, you got one going, you got one in the training cycle, and one under repair.
Wow. Does the NGI involve with the threats we're seeing build from North Korea and other malign actors? Will we be prepared?
With NGI, I believe we will be prepared, and I think the reason why, if you take a look at what the intelligence sources tell us, right, the firm intelligence, we know that those threats are not going to just be unitary single-shot devices, right? They're flying with countermeasures, they're flying with multiple reentry vehicles, multiple maneuver vehicles. So the NGI answer to that, and having 2 companies, 2 great American companies moving forward and competing against each other to beat the timeline and to reduce the risk in the program, we're going to come forward with a capability that has multiple warheads on it that can reduce the shot doctrine. That is our goal. I want to make the job for General VanHerck and his release downstream much easier to where they don't have to worry about numbers of missiles in the arsenal, that they have the capability they need to take on what's coming at us. And we know by looking at the threat projections and where they're going that we've got to take on that higher complexity threat.
Thank you. That's all.
I want to thank you all very much. Thank you for your service and for your dedication to this complex, difficult, and important mission. Thank you for your testimony here today, and I'll make the same statement I did to the prior panel. If there are thoughts that you have that you think would be helpful to us, please supply them to the committee in between now and the beginning of next week. Thank you again all for your service, and we'll look forward to working with you in the defense of our nation. Thank you. Hearing's adjourned.